now. So let me give you a little bit of an outline for how this session is going to work. My name is Kevin Mickey. I am the Professional Education Committee Chair for URISA and help to facilitate what I think is going to be an extremely productive hour. We are very, very fortunate to have with us three presenters today, or panelists, who represent what I would think of as the extremes of what constitutes GIS management in the country. We have Jim Sparks, who is the immediate past Geographic Information Officer for the state of Indiana. We have Cindy Domenico, who is a county official within the city of Boulder, or an official within Boulder, Colorado, and a former URISA president. And we have Steve Steinberg, who is the current Geographic Information Officer for the city of Los Angeles, largest city in the nation. We chose these individuals, and they graciously accepted this invitation because we wanted to provide the opportunity for you to hear how perspectives change on some of these big issues that we're going to talk about today, depending on the context that you work in and the stakeholders that you serve. So the way that we're going to proceed in this hour, the first few minutes, we're going to have each one of the panelists present a little bit about their background and their perspective on how GIS applies to the communities that they represent. Then we're going to address the four big questions that were in the abstract for this panel. And time permitting, we're also going to have the opportunity for you to present questions, which I'd like to offer the chat room as the venue from which to do that. We'll be monitoring that throughout the panel, and I encourage you to chat with yourselves and share ideas at the same time that you're hearing ideas shared from our panelists. We have muted everyone's microphone from the get-go so that we don't have a lot of background noise, given that this is being recorded. So if you do have something that you'd like to contribute to the session this hour, please do so in the chat room. We will be, as I said, recording this and hope to post this to make it accessible to you after the event as well. So without further discussion, I'm going to immediately introduce our first panelist, Steve Steinberg. And Steve, take it away.
Thanks, Kevin, and good morning to the West Coast part of the crowd here, and good afternoon to everybody else. And I do want to make one correction. I'm not the city of LA, I'm the county of LA, but minor difference. Just to give a little bit of background, I've been in the GIS world for, I guess, a relatively long time professionally. Currently at the county of Los Angeles for just over a year. And before that, I did work in the research realm through a public research agency. And prior to that, I was a professor of geospatial science in the California State University system for over a decade. So I have sort of a little bit different perspective, perhaps, than people who followed a career path exclusively in the government or the public sector. As Kevin said, I've been involved with URISA for a while, and recently the past president of SoCal URISA, and some of you who were at GIS Pro last year in Palm Springs may have met me there. And just because I have to put in the plug, yes, I've written a couple of books. You can find them on booksellers everywhere. So, but those are on, sort of looking at GIS in the research and application realms of how we use this to address different problems. So, I've thought about these issues from a lot of perspectives for a long time. Oh, getting some background noise. Okay. So can we advance there, Kevin? So a little bit on, at least from LA County's perspective, the role I'm serving here.
Welcome to Zoom. Enter your meeting ID followed by pound.
We're getting some background. Hopefully that'll go away. So in LA County, the GIO is kind of an interesting role in that obviously I'm
Enter your participant ID followed by pound. Otherwise, just press pound to continue. You are in the meeting now. There are more than 50 participants in the meeting. This meeting is being recorded. You are muted. To mute or unmute yourself,
get that person muted?
Yeah.
Okay. Something strange was going on there. Sorry about that, folks. So anyway, in the county, the GIO works across all of our departments, sort of as an advocate or an evangelist for GIS and geospatial technologies across the county. And in that role, I also work to coordinate how we do GIS policies, procedures, software, hardware, and those kinds of things across the county. So we're set up as a true enterprise GIS sort of structure with central enterprise GIS and then supporting all of our county departments. And structurally, just to give you a sense of how that works for us here in LA, since we are rather large, I chair a steering committee with the GIS managers of each of our departments. And then our enterprise teams does the core infrastructure and data and licensing and things like that, supporting all of our departments. And a number of years ago, about 7 or 8 years ago, LA County worked through a big initiative to set up standard GIS classifications for all of our positions. So we have a series of GIS classifications from technician through manager. There's nine different positions within that class structure when we're doing hiring. And those are the same for GIS folks across all departments. So whether you're working for public health or public works, the GIS classes are the same. And that helps us keep some consistency across the enterprise. So why don't we go ahead? If you're not familiar with LA County, as I said, we're big. We have a population of over 10 million people, which makes us the largest county in the country by quite a bit. Cook County, Chicago area being the second largest.
Please do mute your phones if not already.
Okay. Thank you. And just, for context, that's about, if LA County was a state, we'd be the 9th largest state, about the size of North Carolina. Geographically, it's about 4,000, a little over 4,000 square miles. So fairly large. Go ahead. And along with that, of course, we're big and complex in our governance structure. We have actually more than 34 departments that I have listed there and all kinds of committees, commissions, school districts. It's massive. Over 100,000 employees, more than 4,000 major public buildings, lots of parkland, lots of, natural areas, as well as the built environments that you'd expect, and a huge budget of over $30 billion, of which I get exactly zero as the GIO. So my perspective, and I'm going to try and keep this short so we have time to discuss, because there's a lot. I think number one, coming into government from the academic and research realm, I kind of am an outsider working with our departments and our staff and our administration. And one of the things that I've been asked to do and I'm enjoying doing is trying to move us from sort of the traditional government model of GIS is about making maps and tracking property assessments and things like that, to being more innovative and looking beyond those sort of map making approaches. And in that vein, really pushing sort of a perspective, from an academic education perspective, how do we make our workforce more effective and stay up to date through training, approaching new technology, new tools, and new products to push our innovation. And of course, those of you coming from the government sector know that can sometimes be difficult given job classifications and unions and everything else, how we can keep pushing that. And I think most importantly, and the thing that at some level was surprising to me coming into a large county like LA, was for lack of a better term, the lack of vision that many departments have towards spatial data. Many departments think the non-spatial view of their information is fine and like to work with spreadsheets and tables of numbers and things like that. And it's surprising to me, although not anymore, how often I go in to meet departments across the county and talk about what their questions and business are about, and they think they have no use for GIS. So one of the big things we've been pushing towards is how do we expand GIS across the enterprise? And I think most people on this call probably know almost all spatial that government works in is spatial in some form. We're managing geography and people across geography and services across geography. So helping our departments and our management to understand that has been a real interesting challenge over the last year. So I think with that, I will stop and turn it over to Kevin and Cindy.
All right. Cindy, would you like to introduce yourself? Maybe offer a little bit about your perspective?
Sure, happy to do that. Hi, my name is Cindy Domenico, and Kevin has put up the map of Boulder County, Colorado. And it's a much smaller, Steve, than your location. We're about 750 square miles. And the image that you see there is the elevation kind of map with municipalities identified. And those are also, they include some unincorporated municipalities. We're on a very small, much smaller scale than LA County. We have about 325,000 people. And actually, Kevin, you want to go to the next slide? 325,000 people. Should be a little pop-up that shows there. Maybe it's not. There it is. 1/3 of the county are plains, and it's actually kind of it's almost a microcosm of the state of Colorado. A lot of plains and then a bunch of mountains. So 2/3 of our area is mountainous. 325,000 people, 10 cities, several unincorporated little municipality kinds of things, and 125,000 land parcels. And I know the parcel side of it because I was the assessor for 10 years in Boulder County. So I'm definitely coming from a very public service perspective as I look at the world of data and GIS. And I saw it every day in the work that I did in Boulder County. I just retired in January from a county commissioner seat, served in that county commissioner seat for 11 years, and virtually every land use hearing, every decision that we had around location had some GIS product incorporated into the decision-making process. And I can't imagine what life would be like without GIS, because as you said, Steve, 80% or more of the questions that come into a local courthouse really have to do with location and spatial relationships. And so GIS is vital to the work that we did every day there. We used it for all kinds of things, including knowing the law and regulations around oil wells, where and how could they be sited, and share that information with our internal folks and with the public. We also use GIS portrayal of information coming out of the ballot box. When people vote and make a decision about the things that are on the ballot, there's help there at the end of the process using that and putting that data into a spatial portrayal of support or non-support of a specific type of issue. For example, paving in subdivision areas that needed paving, who supported it, who didn't, and then it gives you an idea of where to start and how to use that information in the most positive way. And I guess the thing that I really wanted to mention to everybody, especially as we were talking earlier about the weather and the flooding scenarios and what's happening out there, that for emergency response, again, the work that our GIS team has done for us is absolutely vital. Everything from fire and flood in our case, and we are still in the recovery process from a 2013 flood. And Kevin, if you'd advance to the next slide. This is just a simple portrayal of precipitation water that fell in 2013 across Boulder County, and you recall the mountainous terrain, and then you see the number of inches and the fact that we get 14 inches on average total per year, and 18 inches fell in the middle of that map in the red zone. You can understand what the rushing waters look like. And the outcome of it, of course, was devastating on a very small scale in our little 750 mile county, which we are still recovering from in terms of rebuilding roads. And what the technology certainly allowed us to do was imagine the impact of the rising waters and to respond to the state questions about how many people would be impacted with the precipitation data and the knowledge of on-the-ground parcels to say, we know that over 12,000 properties will be impacted in the next 3 days. we were able to rush a declaration, a request for disaster declaration to the governor's desk, and it immediately went to the president's office within about 5 days of the very first, the beginning notes of the flooding, and enabled our citizens then to access funding to be able to repair. And Kevin, on that next slide, that shows you the impact of the private bridges that were damaged or destroyed in that process. Just another data portrayal of the information that we needed to respond in decision making and asking for grants from FEMA, et cetera. There's a whole long story there that would take the entire hour, but it's been an interesting experience in that recovery process. And then our next slide, just to show you what our GIS team does in depth too. This is the roadmap that is provided and is our guideline for Boulder County for all kinds of activities. And so I guess my perspective is certainly from that internal public sector side that the work that's done by our GIS team is vital to all the decision making that happens in the courthouse, whether it's at the land use level or at the elected official level for county commissioners and sheriffs and other folks. And so we place a high value on this amazing work. And I think that'll cover it for now. Thanks, Kevin.
All right, thanks, Cindy. Our final panelist, Jim Sparks. Jim, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
You bet, be happy to. Kevin, you've already mentioned I was Indiana's first Geographic Information Officer. State passed a statute to create that office, went into effect July 1st, 2007. I came on board at the end of October and served in that capacity until March of last year, where I returned to the Polis Center. The Polis Center is an applied research center on campus at IUPUI in downtown Indianapolis, and happy to be back with doing some great projects with some great people here for the state. Along the way, I had 2 tours of duty in state government. The first time I was the GIS administrator for NDOT. I've also worked in county government. I mentioned I've been in the university environment a couple of different times. Most of my background, though, is in the private sector, and I found that all of those perspectives came in handy as being a Geographic Information Officer for the state, and actually just growing that office and trying to figure out operationally how to incorporate all the responsibilities that the legislators mandated of that office. But maybe the best thing I can tell you about who I am is I'm going to talk about a real passion of mine, and that's what you see on the screen here, data sharing. If you want to go ahead, Kevin, next slide. So Indiana has 92 counties, and what would you say if I said I would like to invite all 92 counties to voluntarily provide the Geographic Information Office with land parcels, point addresses, road center lines, and local administrative boundaries? Don't have to, but would love it if you did. A lot of folks said if you got 10 or 20 counties, that would be great. I'm happy to tell you that over the course of 5 or 6 years, we were able to get those data sets from all 92 counties in the state of Indiana, and I think that's an amazing accomplishment that speaks well of cooperation at all levels. But I want to talk about what data sharing means in very practical terms. First of all, if you don't have a data sharing, an open data environment, then you're probably charging for data. And what does that actually look like? Next slide. So if we want to turn data into dollars, that means that as a government, we're going to be charging other governments, right? So if I was in state government, I'd have to charge counties and cities, and I would do that full well recognizing that the next day they'd be charging me for their data, and any kind of cooperation around data just wouldn't happen. Well, how about just charging business? Well, okay, you can do that, except that data actually promotes commerce and economic vitality. And are you really sure? I'll show you that in a second. Are you really sure you want to do that? or maybe just charging the public, you know, that public that we would like to be informed so that they can be engaged in policy decisions, that public. We'll just keep data out of their hands because who knows what the public might want to do with it. Now, I don't think either of those sounds real good to me, but let's take the next slide here and look at what happens in the positive sense if you create an open data environment where you can freely share geospatial information. This, what you see on the screen is a return on investment study that was done in 2008. It concentrated on our orthophotography project at that time, and the data came from about 350 or 60 survey participants, and that showed that just from that group of people, there was about $1.7 billion worth of statewide state projects around the state that were supported by that data. Or another way that they sliced and diced that study was we were seeing about a 34-to-1 return on investment for that ortho imagery. Now that's a little better than my 401k. I don't know what you rest of you are experiencing, but that's pretty good. That's wonderful stuff. Next slide here. I thought this was really interesting, and it's also very current. Just saw this in the last couple of weeks, although this commission, the Geospatial Commission that was formed in UK, has been out there maybe a year or so. But that commission was charged with maximizing the value of the geospatial data holding in the UK. And here's the deal. They said, okay, we're going to provide in the way of financial support $40 million in each of the two beginning years for this commission, but we anticipate we're going to get back about $51.4 billion every year for the extra value that will be coming from the economy as a result of that data working its magic out in the economic environment. Go ahead, Kevin. And if all that number stuff is not your bag, maybe this will make sense to you. This top quote comes from Dave Weiss, a wonderful human being who was the head of the Indiana Integrated Public Safety Commission, that said this: when agencies share data, lives are saved. Wow, that's powerful. Love that quote. And by the way, we all become more efficient as a result of that. So those all seem like really good things to me. Go ahead. This is another study that I like to pull out of the slide deck now and then. So this is also something that happened in the UK, but I believe it relates directly to what we see in the US. You can see a listing of all kinds of different data sets, and they're a little bit hard to read, but economy, transportation, agriculture, business, planning, banking, and so on and so forth. The question is, which category of data has the most applicability amongst all sectors? Well, it's the one on the far left, and guess what that one says? It says geospatial. Why is that important? What that says is that with a strong geospatial data holding that's freely distributed in an open data sharing environment, there's just a lot of potential to do great things for the citizens who originally paid for that data, by the way. Go ahead.
So thanks, Jim. We've had a chance to hear a little bit about the backgrounds from each of the panelists and their perspective on some of these big topics that we're going to get into now. What I'm going to do is ask 4 questions, the ones that I'm sure many of you signed up for this panel discussion for in the first place, and go around the room essentially and ask each of our panelists to respond. So let's get started with the first one. Cindy, would you be willing to take this? What are the boundaries between data privacy and the public good in your thoughts?
Well, this is a great question, Kevin. I'm glad that you asked it on it. I'd be really curious about what the participants on the call think as well. Because from a local perspective, we've wrestled with this question for many years. I come from a public record state, which wants to provide basic information, certainly around property ownership and all the background sales transactions, etc. Those are contained in the assessment office's public databases, and they're available to everybody. There are some components of even that side of things which are confidential, which are related more directly to business properties in that environment. So we wrestled with it in that old context where you were able to gather some of the data and we were able to sort of parcel out the public info, but not then, and hold the confidential data solid. Now, in the world of big data and the ability to gather data of all kinds, just because we can, I think the question becomes much more complicated. And when you think about scientific research and medical information and the very big picture of what is the public good in terms of health and in terms of environment, it seems to me that the boundaries get blurred in an interesting way. And maybe it's not so much privacy around individual data that we need to wrestle with, but then that bigger picture of what is data privacy anyway? What is the definition of it in this new world that we work in? So I just one other thing, I know we wrestled with our data floating up to the federal level, but not coming back down. Talk about data sharing issues. That particular one is a challenge. So I'm not sure that I have any really solid answers there, but happy to kick off the conversation.
Thanks, Cindy. Steve, coming from largest population-wise county in the country, got it right this time. What are your thoughts on this? And do you want to respond to anything that Cindy shared?
Yeah, well, I think, I agree with what Cindy said. It's a tricky question, and I've been running into this quite a bit with a number of our social service and public health agencies where, we're trying to balance the needs of those departments and those agencies, to provide services, which requires understanding what would be, sometimes HIPAA data or personal data about our residents, and how we manage that. So, there's the obvious part that we're not going to publish out on an open data portal personal information of individuals or households, much like the census or any other big data set is going to aggregate and summarize. But I think the tricky thing in government too, that at least we're dealing with, is how do we even manage that sort of stuff internally in an effective way? Because as I think everyone recognizes, one of the real powers of GIS and the kinds of analysis we can do is bringing data from different areas of our business together, the mashups that we can build with data. So, sharing data even within our departments across the county becomes an interesting question of data privacy, because I want to take public health data and look at that in context with public works data and, economic data and so on. So one of the things we've been trying to work through is how we can do that in a way that exposes valuable data resources to our county staff doing the analysis for these kinds of questions. And then, for the decision makers and eventually the public facing stuff, how do we represent that in ways that still, protects privacy? And of course, there's lots of ways to do that through aggregation and summarization of data and how we visualize it. I think the one that I'll bring up that wasn't mentioned though by Cindy is the emerging questions around data collected from unmanned drones, which are everywhere now, and I think many of us are using. And we're grappling with that question right now: is what are our policies and procedures around aerial imaging from drones going to be versus aerial photography or the more traditional sorts of ortho mapping that we often do. I think that's an open question. It's probably going to end up going through a number of discussions and probably the courts at some point. But again, I think at the end of the day, I've had to struggle with this one personally. We just had, not that last fall, a major fire here in LA County and Ventura County up near Malibu. You may have seen on the news. And we had staff and ultimately it was the lawyers that got involved, the county council, saying, we could not post evacuation areas on our website for the fire because they were worried that might expose our residents to looting and vandalism if people know that their neighborhood's been evacuated by the county. And I was flabbergasted, to be quite honest, by that sort of an attitude. And I think, again, it was the lack of understanding of the Public Information Office and the departments responsible for managing that process about when is data privacy going to maybe an unreasonable extreme in contrast with health and safety and those kinds of issues. So that's actually a big process we're having to work through right now. Is I have a meeting scheduled next month with our our Office of Emergency Management team to try and figure out how we fix that problem. Because I think the default in many government agencies is we don't want to get sued, we don't want to get in trouble, so let's just not put anything out there that might lead to that. And I think sometimes that fear is paralyzing. And I think the flip side is just we need to get the data out there, and with reasonable caution. So I don't think there's a simple answer to any of this, because there is always that balance between protecting privacy and not getting sued.
And Jim, before you respond as well, just a quick reminder to everyone, I encourage you, take advantage of the chat room. One of the things that I love about this environment that we're in today is you can not only hear what the presenters are sharing with you, but you can also interact with one another in the chat room. So feel free to post your questions or responses to what you're hearing from our panelists. Jim, I know this is a topic near and dear to your heart, as you alluded to a bit in your introduction. Do you want to add a little to that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, and I'd like to add some framework for what we're talking about here, because I think that the thing that we're struggling with is the fact that technology so far outpaces social change, business change, political change, and I would also say legal change. In fact, if you bring up your favorite browser and you were to key in laws of disruption, there's a fellow around 1998, his last name's Downes, D-O-W-N-E-S, said this: social, political, economic systems, and I would add legal, change incrementally, but technology changes exponentially. So what he's saying is our laws and our societal reaction to technology changes, including how freely personal information is made available, is what we're dealing with right now. And I'd like to add just a little bit of a wrinkle to this and take it from any kind of personal information, which, you know, it has a basis all the way back, roots all the way back in the Fourth Amendment, which said, I happen to have this in front of me, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, homes, papers, and effects against reasonable searches and seizures. And that over time grew to include personal information. Steve, you mentioned HIPAA. That's certainly something we think about. Also, the Driver's Privacy Act of 1994 restricted, amongst other things, documenting or printing the person's full social security number. So that's why we see XXX-XX- and then whatever the last four numbers are. But we've all got these little personal location devices that are continually sending a signal, and we keep them in our pockets, for crying out loud. So how that technology is so outpacing all those other changes is just amazing to me, and we're really struggling to keep up with that. But I watch these court cases, and what I'm seeing is how a cell phone can be accessed to reveal personal location information is absolutely being worked out in the court system, and including a court case here in Indiana. A fellow was accused of committing a rash of burglaries, and law enforcement said, we understand personal privacy, but we need to stop this bunch of burglaries that's going on, and we think public safety has more importance than the right for personal location information to be withheld. And we expect the Well, it's gone back and forth, the state Supreme Court decision, then Supreme Court. Supreme Court said, Indiana, you need to take another look at this again, and we expect that court decision sometime the first half of this year. So I guess the court system is how we try to keep up with those exponential technology changes when it comes to this kind of situation.
Do any of you want to have any other words on this topic before we change questions? Okay, let's move on to our next question then. And Steve, I'll field this one to you as a start. How can GIS be effectively leveraged alongside other technological advancements, including all of these things that we're dealing with these days, social media, open data, Internet of Things, and so forth? I know that's something you definitely work with in LA County.
Yeah, and I think, again, going back to what we've heard several times, most data is spatial, and most of the questions and applications we're looking at are geospatial in some form. And I think that extends clearly to, these other advancements. So, we all have different levels of experience with these IoT type sensor networks, whether it's things like traffic cameras that we may have had for a long time, or, newer technologies for, monitoring of air quality or water quality or things of that nature. And I think, I'll give you one really interesting example that our parks department for the county parks has been experimenting with, which is we offer Wi-Fi in a number of our county parks. And it turns out, as some of you may know, that when your mobile device hits a Wi-Fi repeater, there's a MAC address associated with it that's unique, and it can be monitored. It's not truly personal information, although I suppose you could push it that far if you really tried. But what the parks was using it for was to get a sense of when a device enters the park and pings that Wi-Fi repeater, and then how long is it in the park, and where do they, where in the park are these people going, just to get an idea of use of parks at different times and different, days of the week and things like that. And it led to a couple things. One was the intentional use of this IoT kind of technology to just do sort of mapping of the use for planning and maintenance and other purposes. But a secondary and actually unexpected side effect was we got really interesting hits in times we didn't expect, from roughly midnight to 6 a.m. And that raised a number of questions about, who's in the parks after hours that shouldn't be, and, how that relates to either criminal behavior or homeless folks coming in and using the parks as places to, spend the night, and having those facilities or resources available. That was a really interesting thing, because initially it was just intended for one purpose, but we got this unexpected leverage out of that. And as we look at those kinds of things where essentially I'd say we find the unexpected information, we can do a little bit of data mining with all these things. Social media works the same way. You can start geotagging tweets and other social media things to get a sense of where and what your communities are interested in, and starting to look at how we can leverage mobile apps and social media to do a better job. The most common one that's probably familiar to some is the sheriff's department monitoring social media feeds to get a sense of what might be brewing in a particular area of the county, where there's some chatter around some topic or issue of question. So I think there's a lot of those things. I mean, at this point, we're very interested in looking at some of these sorts of technologies for doing our sustainability planning, looking at, environmental data across the landscape, and how that's affecting, health and well-being of the community. So I think at the end of the day, if I were to boil it down to a sentence, again, almost everything is spatial, and all of these other tools that are available to us are just other data sources that we really can leverage and find interesting information, sometimes unexpected information, that helps us make better decisions and do more effective governance.
Thanks, Steve. Jim, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, sure. I won't spend much time with IoT. Great answer, Steve. I will just leave that there. But a couple of things about social media. One is that you might recall that Indianapolis hosted a Super Bowl a few years ago, and there was a group of people kind of behind the scenes who were monitoring social media from a geographic context to be able to maximize the experience of being in downtown Indianapolis for the crowds who were here, and also as kind of an early warning system if something wasn't going the way that it should. I don't know this for a fact, but I strongly suspect that also happened over the weekend. We had this little race in town that draws a few people, and I believe probably that a similar setup was happening there. And then one comment, the other thing about social media that puzzles me a little bit is the promise of using social media and geofencing type technology so that we can have a better consumer experience. So what I'm talking about is your phone sees that you're pulling up outside of an Ace Hardware store and sends you, here you go, Jim, here's a 20% off coupon for grass seed or whatever else. Certainly that capability exists. I think I've seen it here and there in some forms, but that really hasn't taken off. And I'm wondering if it is just anxiety about that information being out in the wild that's stopping that from happening. But curiosity to me that we've not really seen the maturity of that technology for consumers' benefits. And then one comment about open data. In my mind, and I guess this also relates to Internet of Things, but what we're talking about is so much data coming in that you could also have it put big data on here, Kevin, because I guess that's implied. How are we just going to manage the enormous amount of data? And I'm guessing if you're in this webinar, you suspect that geography may be one way to organize a lot of that, and I agree. But wow, data flood, here it comes.
Thanks, Jim. Cindy, you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, just a couple things on the data management side. Exactly right, Jim. It just we're going to be inundated, and how do we parse it out in a way that is going to be where we can track the metadata and all the meaningful components that help you know what you actually have once you've gathered it. That I just would mention a couple things. I think that what intrigues me about the open data and the IoT stuff is the opportunities for public-private connections and interactions. And I'm not sure that we've, in my space, have done as much as we'd like, but one of the things that we have done is create a trail app so that if you're out on the trails and you're in muddy conditions, which happens a lot, you can give us feedback right to the rangers, and then there's a connection directly between the individual enjoying the trail and the person who has to kind of police it and prepare it. We actually used, I'm thinking of the first time that we used Twitter. It's been 10 years ago now, and it was when we had a fire situation and the tweets were going out with updates for people in the vicinity of the fire. So you never know what's going to happen to a nice social media thing over time. It's been pretty interesting to see where Twitter is these days. But I think this particular question we could probably spend an hour on in some future discussions for sure.
Thank you, Cindy. So we have 2 remaining questions, and I think we have just enough time to get some really great feedback. These 2 questions, in my opinion, are where our presenter differences are going to really shine and reflect on the fact that whatever your thoughts are there really differences in how GIS is applied based on whether you're a county, for example, or a large metropolitan area like LA, Los Angeles County, or if you're dealing with a state. And Jim, I'm going to ask you to take the first shot at that because you dealt with all of those different types of scales as a state geographic information officer, and then we'll go downscale in geography and go to Steve and finally Cindy. So Jim?
Sure. The word applies is a little troublesome for me, so I'm going to kind of make up what I think that means as I go along here. There's probably as many similarities as there is differences as you move from managing GIS in one geography versus another one. In the other folks on the panel can certainly address county and city and local. So I'm going to talk for just a second about state. And one of the things that strikes me is that you've got so many different organizations at a state level that you need to collaborate with. And after all, that's how we all get things done, right? We work together. So I mentioned Indiana has 92 counties. We've got several hundred towns and cities. Almost all of those folks have some kind of GIS resource in this day and age. And almost all of those towns, cities, and counties like working together towards a common goal. So good in theory, it's difficult in practice just because of the sheer numbers. But I think if you come to the table and you concentrate on your areas of overlap when you're trying to figure out priorities and goals, that's a much better approach than trying to come to the table and just all of a sudden start talking about your differences. Because at the end of the day, we all want to do meaningful work that makes a difference for our constituents. And you can do that when you recognize what it is that is overlapping amongst all our interests. I'll stop there.
So Steve, I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this. If you picked up shop and moved to Boulder County, for example, or another community,
Hey, that's
would you
an idea.
apply exactly the same strategy that you do in Los Angeles?
That's a tough question. Although Boulder's pretty attractive, so let me know what you got going.
Hey, we'll let you know.
No, I think, for an organization as large as LA County, where we have so many departments, so many employees, so many potential end users of GIS, one of the things we definitely have to think about supporting that broad of an organization is the enterprise structure. So again, we this goes to my predecessor's credit, over a decade ago, made a conscious decision that we were going to centralize our infrastructure and our data repositories and our management of GIS. And then all of the individual departments would hire GIS analysts and technicians that were more, I would say, specialized in the work of that department, a little bit more subject area experts. So, people in public health doing GIS, they're trained in GIS, but they also have often a degree or experience in public health. So they understand the application areas. And what we're doing in that sort of approach is taking away the requirements on those folks in the individual departments to have to do things like install software and manage servers and, do all the other sort of back-end work of managing the enterprise. And they can really focus on, okay, I've got data in my subject area that I'm working in. I've got managers and decision makers asking me to do particular analysis on a question that's very specific to our department's needs, and I can focus on that. So we've really sort of, in a sense, given people more freedom to do their disciplinary work because we're so large. And of course, in a smaller environment, your GIS people often are jack of all trades because they have to be. I didn't mention it earlier, but we have roughly 150 GIS professionals across the county, across all our departments. About 9 of those are focused solely on managing the enterprise, the back end. And then the rest of those are scattered across, specific disciplinary applications. So I think, I find that very helpful, having come from a much smaller research agency where I basically had one GIS analyst who had to do everything for everybody. Now I have specialists who can really focus on that. So I think that's probably the biggest difference. I think, just to wrap up, I'd say the flip side of that is it takes a lot of care and feeding, having steering committees and user meetings and things like that. to keep that organized and to avoid everything sort of going off in 1,000 different directions. So there was a question in the chat that I actually responded to about metadata and how we keep our metadata up to date. Well, we have a CIO directive for geospatial data that says, thou shalt put your data in the repository and it should have metadata. And while there's a directive that says that, of course, that doesn't mean people do it. So one of our enterprise GIS team members every month looks at the repository, and if there's missing metadata or thumbnails or any of the other stuff you'd expect and require, she literally starts pestering people and saying, hey, you've got a data set that doesn't have all the metadata. You have to get this done. So policies are great, but it takes a lot of wrangling and focused staff effort to actually keep that structure going. And I think that's probably the biggest thing in a large area that we've got to deal with.
Thanks, Steve. Cindy, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would say it's also a struggle for us in the smaller structures even to keep those steering committees on track and supported. And I guess the scale difference to me would be, you're looking at 150 people, Steve, in your environment. We've got almost 20 total across our organization. And just about 3.5 of them are in the central support system in the place that does the, bringing the equipment up and running and the software updates and all that. So we have quite a few subject area experts out there distributed, but their jobs are not just GIS typically. And so we run with a smaller scale, and we also have, I think, I would say restricted dollars in a smaller environment. We just don't have the same level of funding that we'd like. And my dream someday is to have a GIO in Boulder County. That would be ideal. So when you're ready to move on, or when you're ready to look at something different, because I think that's what it takes. It takes that person at that sort of cabinet or department head level that is focused on making this work. So I would look forward to that in the future for us.
So guys, I'm going to twist this question a little bit. The participants in this webinar and the panelists that are presenting and discussing these questions today, I think we're the choir. We already know GIS is worth it. I'm going to twist it this way though. If you had to, as I'm sure you all have had to do this, stand in front of the governor, mayor, county commissioner, whoever it happens to be, and answer the question, is it worth it? Is it worth the cost? In 1 or 2 sentences, how would you respond? And how would you quantify that if possible? And why don't we start, Steve, do you want to take a crack at that one?
Well, my flippant answer would be, let me turn off the servers for a day and you'll see how much it's worth it to you. I mean, we accidentally have that happen on rare occasion where something goes down, and literally within minutes, we hear from all the affected departments about how they cannot do their business when something's broken. So I think that, at sort of a one level really demonstrates across many of our departments how much they rely on what I've come to just call our data infrastructure for GIS is just as important as our road infrastructure or our electrical infrastructure or anything else. Many of our departments simply rely on it. Now, we have not done the formal ROI type of study on how much return on investment we get. That's actually something, being new to the county, I'm looking at and talking to management about ways that we might be able to bring in an outside contractor or a researcher to do that assessment. But I think our county across every level, from our board of supervisors to department heads to staff who are doing daily work, they very quickly realize that they cannot do their job without it. So now, dollars and cents wise, hard to say. The way I actually do it is I say, this is how much we spend on GIS in our county. This is how much our neighbors are spending, which actually happens to be much more. So look, we're way bigger and we're spending way less. We're getting really good value because we have really good people.
Great answer. Cindy, what are your thoughts on this?
Sure, I'd like to piggyback on the quote that was mentioned earlier: when agencies share data, lives are saved. Portrayal of that shared data saves lives too. And that I know is true based on our experience with the flood. And our board of county commissioners knows what value that data had for us in helping our citizens. And when a Type 2 fire incident commander lands in your county and says, hey, you know, can we access your GIS data? And you can say, yes, have at it. It's all there. Take, you know, do whatever you need. Then, you know, in that moment, it's worth everything.
Jim, I know that you had mentioned the 34-to-1 return on investment study that was done in '08. I know that wasn't the last time you had to defend the value of GIS and the role that you played in the state. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't need a hypothetical here. I'll go back several years back when I was doing consulting, and I was interested in doing an GIS implementation plan for Evansville and Vanderburgh County, the county that Evansville sits inside of. And we were down to do a presentation, and we had the laptops open, and they were hooked up to projectors, and the screens were lit up, and we were ready to go. And the mayor walked in, and he wasn't scheduled to be in that meeting, so it kind of caught everybody off guard. And he said, how about we just turn all this stuff off and talk for a little while? He says, I get calls every day about chug holes. They need to be fixed. I don't ever get calls about GIS. So could you explain to me why I should spend money on GIS instead of fixing the chug holes? And I was able to do that by showing him, first of all, a pavement condition deterioration slope. So pavement condition going from 0 to 100, 100 being new pavement, and how pavement deteriorates over time. Where he's talking about applying resources is kind of down at the bottom of that curve when it really gets to be a problem. But the most cost-effective place to apply resources is somewhere around the 75 to 80% deterioration mark. Well, how do you know where that is? Well, you're going to need a pavement condition study, which, by the way, will sit on top of a geographic information system using street networks. And wouldn't it be nice, Mr. Mayor, if you could put projects together because you've got a similar situation and they're next to each other in terms of geography? They're just down the street or a half a block over or whatever. And I said, if you have this tool to help you, you'll catch up someday with your pavement defects. But if you keep trying to just fill chug holes without the benefit of that, good luck, it won't happen. We did the project.
Well, I appreciate all the great feedback you guys have provided on these questions. There's a number of questions and conversations that went on in the chat room, which I'm delighted to see. Our presenters have graciously offered to respond to those. We'll post that along with the recording for this webinar on the website. You'll be getting a notification about that in the coming days. So Cindy, Steve, and Jim, thank you ever so much.
You're welcome.
For what
Thank you, Kevin. It's great. You're welcome.
You know, it's rare when we get people that have had the longevity and depth of the experience that you have at all the different scales that you work together at the same time to compare thoughts and notes. And to me, that's what URISA is all about. You know, on that, there are so many educational opportunities coming up. Hopefully everyone that's watching today is familiar with these conferences. We've got a number of, and I'll ask Wendy in just a moment to perhaps comment a bit on these. We also have a number of additional webinars that are going to be coming up on using GIS for CAMA, disaster management, various things related to coastal GIS and so forth. So stay tuned, watch your emails to those announcements. Wendy, do you want to perhaps say a couple things about our conference lineup?
Certainly. Some of you, and I've looked at the participant list, I've recognized a lot of names from folks who have attended our URISA GIS Leadership Academy in the past, and who have attended GIS Pro and who have participated as a speaker at our conference. And I hope you'll check out the lineup of events we have coming up. We just finished off the GIS Leadership Academy in Raleigh, North Carolina last week. We had 60-some people there. It was one of the biggest ones we've had yet, and it was a huge success. And I think all of you folks who are interested in GIS management, that's why you attended this webinar. I think you'd get a lot out of the GIS Leadership Academy as well. I'm posting a link also to a survey that our GIS Management Institute is doing right now on GIS management practices, and I got them to extend the deadline to participate in that until June 17th. So it would be fantastic if we could get participants from this group to check out that survey and provide your feedback. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Wendy. And thanks again to our presenters. I do appreciate all of you taking an hour out of your busy schedules today to sit in on this and in many cases offer your contributions to the conversation. And I hope it's been worth that investment of your time. So until next time, have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks, that was great.
Folks.